Consumers want to know the facts about the products they buy, but America's agricultural landscape is not easy to navigate. Between different companies, scientific advancement, government regulations, advertisement campaigns, and an unhealthy amount of myth and misconception, anyone would be hard-pressed to make sense of it. That's where Real Ag comes in. From the producers who make your food, to the store where you buy the final product, and everything in between. This is Real Ag. Now, here's your host, Kyle Bauer.
Welcome to Real Ag. The popularity of the craft beer industry is growing nationwide and also right here in Kansas. Beer lovers can't get enough of the small batch, fresh ingredients, and made close to home brews. Friendly neighborhood microbreweries feature up-and-coming brewmasters, provide jobs, and boost the local economy. We'll find out more about craft beer on this edition of Real Ag.
Production of Real Ag is made possible by
the Kansas Soybean Commission, the Soybean Checkoff, progress powered by farmers.
What are ales?
Ale is beer. It's just a different type of yeast that's used to ferment the beer. So ale is going to have a little bit more body. The way that it ferments is a little different. The temperature it ferments is a little different. And it does take a shorter period of time to hit full attenuation or full fermentation of the finished beer.
It is a top fermenting yeast where lagers, which is the other type of beer, are made with a bottom fermenting yeast. So those are the two official categories of beer, are ales and lagers.
What are lagers?
Lagers are a different type of yeast strain. I won't get into the too scientific on it, but they're going to ferment for a longer period of time. They're going to ferment a little bit colder at a little lower temperature, and they end up cleaning up the beer quite a bit more during that fermentation process because it is longer. And lager actually means, to store. So after you ferment a lager beer, traditionally it is to be stored in a cold environment so the yeast can really clean up the beer over a longer period of time. So some traditional lagers would even be stored for up to 6 months before they were served.
We produce about 7 different ales and are currently producing 2 different lagers.
I think right now with the American craft beer movement, we're moving more towards ales, even since the late 1980s, early 90s. But prior to that, it was a lot more lagers and pilsners were being drank. And I think in Western Kansas also, we're still educating people to drinking more ales from their traditional lager beers they've been drinking, whether it's Bud Light, Miller Lite, Coors Light, that kind of thing. So I think we're just getting into more ales here in the past 20 years.
The people that like dark beers, but as a rule, we're in light beer country, and that's one of the things that we decided early on. If people like, well, the way I told the brewers, if everybody wants vanilla, we don't need to make a lot of chocolate. So that's the way we approached it all, and we are one of the very few microbreweries that actually makes a lager beer, and the lager is known for its a crisp, more refreshing taste, not as heavy. And we make a couple different lagers, and the one that you're going to see really rise to the surface quickly is called Life Coach, and it's in 30 packs. It's very competitively priced.
Does a brewmaster require education or training?
What started the brewery is this. The city of Washington was really good about promoting Bradford Built, our original business, and getting us into Washington. So much that they built us a building that we purchased from the city over the course of the next few years. But they basically served as our rich uncle to get us moved into town. As a thank you, so to speak, for that, we felt obligated when Main Street started to empty that we should work on putting businesses in it and filling it back up and bringing more business back into town. So we put in Mayberry's, a restaurant right across the street from where we're at today. And then a little while later, we put in Smoky Hills Boots, and it's a Western store. The boot shop is really impressive for a town of 1,156 people. And then next door to that, we put in Miss Donna's Dollhouse, which is all women's clothes. And was thinking about what's good for your town, what brings people to town, and after asking a lot of questions, I found out that a brewery is basically the #1 attraction, and so that seemed like a logical next step to bring more people into downtown Washington.
I was a home brewer for about 7 years before I started here. This is the first production brewery I've worked at, and I've been here for about 2 years.
Everything I've learned, I did a little bit of home brewing while I was in college. When I started managing here, I learned a lot and attended a lot of seminars with our master brewer and trained under him for just about a year prior to taking over his position. Since then, I've attended seminars and recently accepted into Siebel Institute in Chicago for basically a certificate of advanced brewing theory that I'll be taking next year over the course of probably the next year and a half or so. The growth is phenomenal. I don't think we've quite hit the bubble with growth. I think the more that people educate themselves, the more their palates get evolved, the more they understand what great craft beer is and what okay craft beer is. So I think a lot right now there's a rapid growth in the industry. A lot of the okay craft beer is kind of starting to slim out, and more craft breweries are getting competitive and attending more schools. The education is much higher. So I think right now from 10 years ago, a lot of the beer, a bigger percentage of the beer is great craft beer. You know, the brewers are getting smarter, they're developing new techniques, new methods, new ways of saving energy and saving water. So I think it really keeps everybody on their game as far as brewers. And there's a little bit of competitive nature with us brewers, but for the most part it's camaraderie. You know, we really try to support each other and share ideas and share new recipes or new products or things so we can all succeed together. You know, it's the more, you know, even if a brewery were to open here in town, which we'd have another one, I don't look at them necessarily as competition. I look at them as another avenue where customers can educate themselves and we can both grow together. More people drink craft beer, it's win-win for both of us.
Are there government regulations concerning starting a brewery?
There is a lot of government regulations. I think, it's pretty heavy duty with rules and regulations. But it's just like anything else. You ask a lot of questions and you find out, and you try to get all that discovered before you get started. And like anything, you're going to find out that you missed something here or there. But so far, everybody's been really good to work with, especially other breweries. That's one thing about the brewing business is people will take any amount of time and spend a trip to Washington, Kansas to help us out if we have a question. And I would like to think we can do the same thing for other startup breweries. But it's a big, fun bunch of people to be involved with. And I haven't met anybody in the brewing business so far that hasn't just been fantastic to work with. Will help you any way they can. There's no trade secrets. They will show you exactly how they do it. And it's been a lot of fun in that respect.
There's going to be federal regulations, but also different states are very different on what their laws are as far as starting breweries and having different microbrewery licenses and liquor licenses, and even with distilleries, you know, sometimes the ownership role comes into effect where you can't own one type of business and own a microbrewery. So there is quite a few hurdles to get through when opening a microbrewery.
Sometimes the rules seem cumbersome, but I'm sure that's, you know, that's not by intent. It's just, you know, you have a rule, then you add another rule, then you add another rule, and sometimes you got to call the people that are in charge of issuing the citations, you know, and ask them, how do I interpret this? So far, we haven't met anybody that on the state side or on the federal side, either one, that hasn't just bent over backwards to help you out and make sure you get it right. It's been a very good experience.
What is the process of brewing beer?
Well, it starts with malted barley or malted wheat, and I won't get into that process, but basically you're converting the starches in that malted barley or wheat into fermentable sugars. So we're trying to use the sugars from that malted barley or wheat, and there's other things that they provide as well. And we're going to create a mash with those, and we're going to use water. We look at pH of the water and the water chemistry. Are also going to add flavor compounds, and also, you know, the alkalinity is going to decide an ideal pH range further down the line. So we'll make a mash with all of those combinations of barleys or wheats. That's going to rest for a certain period of time at a certain temperature and a certain pH. Once that's done, we'll transfer that to a kettle and boil just that wort that came off of that grain. Then we add the hops during the boil that are going to be kind of the spice for the beer and the bitterness for the beer. You can get quite a few different flavors from different types of hops also, and a variety of hops in your boil. Once that boil's done, generally it's about 90 minutes, we'll cool that down and add oxygen to it and put it in a fermenter where we add yeast. We have to add the oxygen back in because after boil it removes a lot of that oxygen. So we'll add so many cells of yeast to that fermenter so that yeast can consume those sugars, and then the byproduct is alcohol and CO2. So we're looking for a really healthy, certain type of fermentation in there, so we don't produce any alcohols that'll give you a headache. We have a nice, clean flavor profile after fermentation is complete, and some off flavors have been scrubbed away. Once that ferments, generally ales, let's say 14 days, lagers generally 30, 45 days. Then we'll transfer that off of the yeast into a bright beer tank. Here, for example, in a brew pub, our serving tanks are our bright beer tanks where we can carbonate the beer and condition it there, and then it can be served to the customer from that tank right to the faucet behind the bar. Generally, a brew day, when we to make the mash and to boil and go into a fermenter, a brew day around here is about 8 or 9 hours. That'll ferment for a couple weeks, and we'll kind of baby that fermenter throughout that time and work with it. Generally, I think the process for us is about 11 to 12 hours total time off and on to produce an ale.
The reason we don't malt any of our own grain is because it takes a large facility and a lot of know-how and a lot of testing to make sure that the grain you're using is appropriate for the style of beer that you're brewing.
There are a couple of Kansas hop farms that a lot of Kansas breweries have been utilizing, but most of our malt really has to come from up north in the United States. And kind of globally, there's a hop and a barley belt where a lot of these grow, and right now Kansas just really isn't part of that belt where you can successfully grow. And all of the malting companies, we could grow barley or wheat here, but to actually go through that malting process would be extremely difficult. You almost would have to have your malting process happen right where that barley can grow the best, so which for the most part happens up in northern United States for where our products come from.
I think the only breweries that malt their own grain are the very large commercial breweries. Virtually all craft breweries bring in malt.
You can work as many hours as you want. We put in, the guys here put in 40-hour weeks, but they'll offset their schedules because if we're brewing a lot of beer that day, they'll brew back-to-back batches. And so a lot of times they'll get the grain ready to go the day before, and then in the morning one of the brewers will come in about 5 or 5:30 and they'll drop grain and get the process started, and then through the course of the day another guy will come in and take over, and by 7 or 8 o'clock that evening everything is pretty well cleaned up and the dish is done and put away and ready to go again the next day. So we can brew 20 barrels at a time. A barrel is 31 gallons in beer, but 20 barrels at a time, and we'll typically brew 3 batches of 20 barrels in a day. We are going to be doing something that's an all Kansas beer as soon as we can. Yeah, right now it's about making the same beers over and over and having very good consistency and making sure that we distribute well and timely and keep everything fresh and concentrate real hard on the basics and go real deep and real strong locally and throughout the state of Kansas.
There would be a significant decrease in cost if we could source locally, absolutely.
Tell me the difference between a home brewer and a professional producer.
I guess all of the chemistry is exactly the same. The beer brewing process is the same as when I was a home brewer. The equipment is significantly different. So was the largest learning curve, is figuring out how all of the brewing and packaging equipment works. And yeah, it took a little while to get that right. So.
A lot of home brewers, you have a hard time finding the information. Really, what makes particular water chemistry or mash chemistry or in the boil. So they're constantly, forming these homebrew clubs, sharing ideas and learning as much as they can, trying to learn as much from professional brewers. But even us professional brewers are still constantly learning and developing new ideas. So I think the access of information for homebrewers is a little bit less. There is quite a few forums, and there's American Homebrewer Association where they provide quite a few seminars and pieces of information online for homebrewers. But it's just trying to find the information and brew enough batches to really understand the trench and to see the acidity of the malt and the water chemistry and things. So it's just, I think it's a lot more difficult to find, basically to find the education to make great homebrew beer.
Does the equipment require special cleaning?
Everybody is more particular or less particular than others, but during the brewing process, we're constantly cleaning. I think brewers are generally cleaning more than we're actually brewing. We're very meticulous about sanitization back there because you can develop off flavors and infections in the product. So even as we do a brew day, once we come out of our mash tun into the kettle, then we clean the mash tun immediately. Once we come out of the kettle, we clean the kettle immediately. After fermentation is done, once we rack out of a fermenter into a bright tank, we clean the fermenter immediately. So it's a constantly kind of cleaning and working with the beer at the same time. I think we spend probably 75% of our time cleaning and 25% actually making beer.
All of our equipment's cleaned after it is used. We're using yeast, which is essentially a domesticated fungus. And so the beer that we make loves to have fungus growing in it, so we need to make absolutely sure that yeast is the only thing that's allowed to grow in the beer, because other things that are not desirable will readily grow in it as well.
We just try to be as meticulous as possible, even if sometimes it might be unnecessary. It's in the end result, it's always going to be a cleaner product. The cleaner you can keep your brew house.
What do you do with the byproducts?
Really, the only byproduct that we worry about, getting rid of is our spent grain. After the mash is done and we take the wort off, we give that to a local farmer here in Hayes that feeds it to his cattle. But really, we don't ever dump beer very much. And I think one time since I've been involved with this company, we've had to dump a batch of beer. But for the most part, everything that we produce does get sold out through the front of house.
The byproduct, as in the mash, or the spent grain we call it, I take that out and feed it to my cattle. And we're feeding it to a bunch of steers right now that are within 30 days of being processed, and we will provide Mayberries with beef.
Which is better, packaging in a can or a bottle?
If you could put everything in a can, that would be fun for me because it's less than half the money for the container. But the bottles present themselves very well. Some people feel they can discern a flavor difference between bottles and cans. I don't think you really can. Maybe somebody could, but if you dump one I prefer it in a glass personally. So if you dump a can into a glass or you dump a bottle into a glass or you pour it tap, there's really no difference because the canned is preferred if you look at it from the manufacturer standpoint because it blocks out all the light. It's easy to stack. It's just easy to work with. The bottles have always, I guess there's just a thing about bottles. So many people just prefer them. At Mayberries, we had some leftover canned beer from a bike rally. And it sat in the cooler for a month, and I said, let's just pay the taxes on this and get it out of here and have a free beer. There was probably 20, 30 cans. And people would read the sign that said free beer in the iced cans and reach across the bar with $2 and buy the very same beer in a bottle. So when we initially looked at, do we go cans or bottles, we knew we'd have to do both, and that's what we did. And probably always will unless something drastic changes, but we probably always will.
I think it's still kind of a toss-up, but I'll tell you now, in the industry, more and more breweries are moving towards cans. Not only shipping costs and it's easier recyclable, but Cities like Hayes, you can bring beer down to the Frontier Park and play frisbee golf, but you're not allowed to have glass. So a lot of times with national parks and with more active people, which generally craft beer drinkers are a little more active and a little more in tune with the healthier lifestyle or sustainability, they can take those cans with them on a hike or while they're frisbee golfing or if they're on a bike ride or something like that, whereas you wouldn't be able to bring glass to those places either. So I think there's a lot of benefits on the can side that outweigh the bottles, but a lot of guys are still sticking with that charm of the bottle, and that's just, it's still a great package for the beer.
I guess we do both. I like bottling better because our bottling line's a lot faster than our canning line, so that makes a difference. But I think quality-wise, they come out pretty similar as long as they're packaged correctly.
How long is the life of beer?
I think everybody looks at that a little bit different because after fermentation, the pH of the beer drops so low that really no known pathogens can grow in the beer. So it's just a matter of how long does the flavor of the beer stay to the standard of what the brewer intended. So a lot of guys will say 180 days or 120 days. I think a lot of darker beers and even some more barrel-aged beers, some bigger, higher gravity beers, there are people that are cellaring those and treating them just like wine. So we've had 2-year-old vintage beers that have been barrel aged. There's even Belgian style beers that have been aged for up to 3 years or longer in barrels. So it's just a matter of what the flavor that the brewer intends and how long that flavor stays. Around here, when we do our in-house bomber runs, generally we have about a 180-day shelf life for those. I know a lot of other breweries that do package and distribute put it either 120 or 180-day shelf life on the product just for flavor intentions. But I imagine it would last much, much longer than that if given, the proper storage temperatures, if they're kept cold, if they're kept out of the sun, that kind of thing. So it is quite some time the beer lasts.
We mark all of our beers for 4 months when they're packaged. You can get a beer to last up to a year pretty easy if it's stored in good conditions. Beer deteriorates much faster the warmer the temperature it's stored at. So if it's kept cold, it lasts longer.
There are quite a few large breweries that just have big barrel houses that have over thousands of barrels where they'll take different batches of those barrels and blend them down into one product. So that's kind of a new trend that's really becoming popular, especially within the Brewers Association. You can even just see at the competitions the increase in entries of these wooden barrel-aged and these strong ales that people are doing.
Are there regulations for the transportation of beer?
There's a lot of regulations, and a lot of that is interstate versus intrastate, and but it's just another hoop to jump through. But my wife is a really good paperwork lady, and she's got a whole bunch of gals that work with her that they keep us all out of jail. Everything that we deliver in Kansas, we just deliver to Salina, to Crown Distributing, and then Crown Distributing interlines with other Coors Miller distributors in the state of Kansas. And so we've gone to, we go through Wichita, Hayes, Dodge City, Salina, Topeka, and Kansas City.
With Kansas, we're on a 3-tiered system, so I cannot self-distribute hypothetically. I have to sell that beer to a distributor, and that distributor has to sell it, or a wholesaler has to sell it to a retail outlet. That's just one of the state laws, and there's quite a few states that have that 3-tier system. There's also quite a few states, Colorado for example, where you can self-distribute. I don't have to use a distributor. I can turn a higher profit on my product and sell it to local outlets and deliver it ourselves, have our own salespeople. And there are benefits to that also, but sometimes, with a lot of these breweries, you get so busy and it's quite a bit to manage that, when you get to a larger scale, it is easier to use a distributor. So even those breweries that can self-distribute will in turn use a distributor in correlation with a little bit of self-distribution also. And besides just the 3-tier system, there is quite a few other labeling aspects on a federal level and a state level that you have to look at too before your package can leave the brewery.
Tell me about the laws you have to follow to allow sales of carry-out containers of beer.
In the past, you had to sell in the state of Kansas your beer in a growler to go. It had to be a certain size, it had to be in that original growler. You couldn't fill other breweries' growlers. Now, within the last few years, we're able to fill other breweries' growlers from other cities. They have to be sealed, so that way it's not an open container. So we put a shrink wrap on the top of our growlers just to say this is a sealed product. That doesn't keep any oxygen from escaping or getting into the product. It just kind of shows any local law enforcement this is a sealed container. But hypothetically, if it didn't have that wrap on there, that can be considered an open container, and then someone could get a fine. And honestly, it would be no different from a customer walking out the door with a pint of beer. We would get a fine as well as the customer would get a fine for having that open container.
We have millennials, and we also have a table of people that have been retired for a long time, long time. And they come in here on Thursday night and they just have a ball. And that's probably one of the most fun things is the diversity. You'll see everybody in here. We've got everything from our grandkids that'll come in here, from little tiny babies on up to people that are, I'm sure, in their 90s, and everybody in between. We do have seasonal beers, and that is a fun thing to do. We have a beer that we call Summer Breeze. That's a lemonade and a beer. It's a shandy. They call it a lemon shandy, but we call it Summer Breeze, and it's got a picture of a tornado on the can. And I just remember from being a little kid hiding in the Frady hole, one of the tornadoes trying to suck the doors off the storm cellar, and my grandpa was holding them down with a rope, and he said, "That's a pretty good breeze." And I just always remember, it just seems like people, I guess, eventually around here get used to tornadoes to the point where it's a summer breeze.
Nearly 5,000 breweries were operating in the United States in 2016, with plans for at least 2,200 more. As long as there's a growing consumer demand, beer lovers will continue to enjoy craft brewed beer from small independent producers, and someday a quality crop of Kansas barley could show up in your favorite beer. We hope you have enjoyed this episode of Real Ag. Remember, you can see every program of this series by going to SmokyHillsTV.org. On behalf of the Real Ag crew, I'm Kyle Bauer, and this has been Real Ag.
Production of Real Ag is made possible by
the Kansas Soybean Commission, the Soybean Checkoff, progress powered by farmers.